as a supplement to any material in the textbook or to any of the readings and multimedia examples uploaded to your course supplement software, here is a selection of subtle propaganda techniques or subtle cognitive traps that any good citizen can fall into when dealing with propaganda, strategic communication, PR, or just everyday domestic argumentation. Culled from over 15 years of teaching argumentation, debate, media, politics, rhetoric, and so forth, here's my top 10. Any top 10 list will bring up the issue we run into with the very first known thesis on argumentative fallacies from Aristotle. You look at the list and think, well, is this a how-to guide for unscrupulous PR professionals, or is this a self-defense manual for all free citizens everywhere? And the answer is both. Rhetoric cuts both ways, and anything that can be used to defend yourself from being manipulated is also something that can be used to manipulate the less informed or more gullible members of a population or your community. If you're not in my moral universe, here are 10 tricks you might be able to use in politics and advertising to get one up on the competition. If you're in my moral universe, here are some self-defense techniques not only against being on the receiving end of a particularly unscrupulous political PR campaign, for example, but also mental and cognitive traps that any of us might fall into when we're making arguments or defending our positions. And by us, I mean everybody in this course, including me. We'll take them in alphabetical order. First, either or, also known as the false dilemma. Nothing wrong with a good argument from dilemma. If there are only two logical outcomes and they are both good or both bad, then we can praise or blame a public figure very easily. In a political scandal, a certain person in charge either had foreknowledge of the events or did not. Therefore, the only possible logical alternatives are criminal behavior or gross negligence. There's no escape. If a gifted comic actor seems to have improvised a brilliant bit off the top of her head, we might argue about whether or not it was scripted and she acted as though she improvised it, or whether it was all improvised. Either way, she's a terrific talent. The false dilemma takes a situation with at least three and usually multiple possible logical outcomes and treats it as though there are only two possibilities. I'm not sure why Americans fall into this so often. It's the two-party system, the Civil War, influence of fundamentalism or race relations. I don't know what it is. But I used to tell folks that in the US, there are always two sides to every story, and in Canada, there are at least three. I think that's still true, although in recent years it seems that in American terms there are two sides to each story, and one of them is evil and must be destroyed. Problem number 2, fallacious appeals. There are so many of these that the Romans had actually cataloged a couple hundred of them and given them technical terms in Latin. One of them still persists in English. The ad hominem attack is an attack on the speaker or the speaker's associates or community rather than what the speaker is actually saying or trying to propose. You've probably heard of the fear appeal, the appeal to pity, appeals to tradition, the bandwagon fallacy, the appeal to popularity, and so forth. What they all boil down to is one simple idea, and that is a plea on the part of the source of the argument or the speaker or the campaign or the company that you ignore what you call evidence and ignore what you would call clear thinking. Forget about that. Look over here to what you could gain or look over there to what you could lose if you disagree with the point of view being put forward. Number 3, false equivalence. In other words, we're all to blame. Everybody's guilty. They're all the same. You say the guy I voted for has lied 15,000 times on television and in writing. Well, are you saying his predecessor never lied? No, I'm saying his predecessor lied about 30 times and stopped doing it every time he was caught. Your guy has turned on a fire hose of lies and kept it up for years. Whenever you hear anybody saying, well, they're all the same, everybody tries to get ahead, everybody cheats, everybody lies, you will find that whoever benefits from that comparison, whoever has extraordinarily bad behavior seen as something normal that everybody kind of does sometimes, that the person who behaves the worst is the one who benefits from the false equivalence comparison. The fire hose, a 21st century term, refers to a massive acceleration of the old propaganda technique of repetition. The classic idea was to take a message, simplify it, and repeat it continuously. With a fire hose, you take the message, and whether it is true or not, you keep repeating it, and then you keep repeating different messages on a regular basis. The idea being that no group of journalists can keep up with whether or not everything you are saying is true. And the public thinks, well, they wouldn't keep repeating all these things if they were all lies, would they? And if you've ever caught yourself trying to figure out who's telling the truth and who's not among a number of media sources, and you feel like giving up and thinking, well, now I don't know who's lying and who's telling the truth or who to believe, mission accomplished. That is the purpose of the fire hose technique, to get as many citizens as possible to simply stop paying attention. In other words, to induce false equivalence, saying, well, they're all the same. They each have their own opinion. I guess I'll let them fight it out. This is often used in conjunction with the fifth technique, gaslighting. From the 1938 play Gaslight, made into a popular movie starring Ingrid Bergman in 1944, gaslighting refers to telling people lies that are so obvious they doubt their own memories, or they cannot believe you'd lie about something so obvious, so there must be something wrong with them. Now, abusive spouses and parents have done this to partners and kids for generations. It's only in recent years that we have seen government officials looking into a camera and stating that something the audience knows happened, perhaps even the day or the week before, did not in fact happen. Is the official insane? No. What's happening is that the official is hoping that the most credulous members of his audience or support group will believe him and not the evidence that comes from all of those biased media sources. In essence, the official is instructing people how to think and what opinion to hold. Next, a few that all of us have stumbled over at one time or another. Number 6, God and devil terms, from a couple of American rhetoric professors, Kenneth Burke, who came up with the term, and the conservative thinker Richard Weaver, who popularized it. The idea is to take a value-neutral descriptive term and use it in such a way that your listeners or community will equate with good or evil. So, for example, if you call an American politician a socialist, and that person has referred to himself as a socialist for 20 years, but has recently distinguished himself as a democratic socialist, well, you're not really messing with God and devil terms. If, on the other hand, you take a pragmatic centrist whose policy draws from both liberal and conservative ideas and call him a socialist, knowing that your listeners will equate socialist with communist and communist with evil, then you're using God and devil terms. There are no hard and fast rules for what the God and devil terms are. In some communities, atheist is a devil term. In others, it's a God term. And for many, it's just a word. For some groups, liberal is a God term. Others, it's a devil term. Same with the word conservative. And for others, they're just words that describe particular dispositions, temperaments, or policy platforms. Number 7 is one of the rare examples in which an argument is not simply a distraction or an ethical failure, but is an actual logical error. It boils down to the idea that half of all categorical statements you can make are reversible, but half of them aren't. The 4 categorical declarations you can make are that all A is B, some A is B, no A is B, and some A is not B. Now, a couple of these run backwards and forwards. If some Jewish folks are Buddhists, well, some Buddhists are Jews. If no Pentecostals are Muslim, well, there are no Muslim Pentecostals either. Now, to say that some followers of Christ do not accept his divinity, that doesn't run backwards, but we don't run into that one very often. Some non-acceptors of Christ's divinity are it gets confusing, and we don't run into that very much in everyday speech. The one we run into is all A is B. That doesn't run backwards, but a lot of people treat it as if it does. For example, research shows that good spellers tend to be bright. That will induce a lot of people to assume that bright people can spell well. It will induce people to draw conclusions about bad spellers or people who aren't bright. But it only runs in one direction. It may be the case that all children with attention deficit disorder exhibit hyperactive behaviors. It sure doesn't mean that all hyperactive kids need to be on medication. In number 8, we distinguish the slippery slope argument from the slippery slope fallacy. In a slippery slope argument, you set up a chain of if-then propositions. If A, then B, if B, then C. And your argument is that taking that first step could very easily lead toward a result down the line that you don't want to get to. If we allow this relaxation of a political norm, what's next? Are we becoming more authoritarian? If I start smoking, what's next? Smoking something illegal, smoking something addictive or deadly, and so forth. The old gateway drug argument is a slippery slope argument. The slippery slope fallacy is a perversion of this. The idea that taking any step in a particular direction will necessarily and swiftly lead to catastrophic consequences. An argument against stem cell research might raise the specter of rich people cloning designer babies. That's a slippery slope fallacy. The idea that background checks for gun purchases, what's next? The liberals coming and taking all our guns away? No, that's not next. It's an emotional distraction that we can call not a tightly argued step-by-step slippery slope argument, but the slippery slope fallacy. Number 9, one of the few that has come down to us from its original Latin. Tu quoque simply means you too. The you too argument pops up a lot in marital quarrels and arguments between boyfriends and girlfriends. What happens is that a person accused of certain bad behavior says, well, you do it too, or you did it last week, or you did it 10 years ago. When you accuse your political opponent of doing something that you've been accused of doing. It is often an effective distraction from what we're actually talking about. The logical trick is that you cannot say you too or you also without conceding the point that you are guilty. You too is always an admission of guilt to make the other party guilty too. Finally, number 10, what I'll call waiting for perfect evidence. I don't really have a name for it yet. I've noticed it for some time. I'm not the only one who's noticed the phenomenon, but it involves the persuader or propagandist using terms that are understood in a narrow technical sense in the scientific community and more casual way by the general public. So what the general public might call a theory, a scientist would call a hypothesis. So when someone arguing against Darwinian evolution for a non-scientific audience says, well, it's just a theory, the public understands, well, it's just a guess or a supposition, we shouldn't take it too seriously. Theory has a much more rigorous, much more definitive meaning in the scientific community. Or decades ago, when the tobacco industry was asserting that because not every last smoker contracted lung disease, that one couldn't say that cigarettes caused lung disease. That convinced some people in the general public who continue to smoke, but it is not how a trained statistician establishes a correlation and infers a causation from it. We see the exact same arguments being used today with respect to climate change. So to wrap up, we've covered some of the subtler uses of propaganda, not only used by unscrupulous persuaders in the public sphere, but stumbled upon by accident by all of us from time to time when we're just trying to work out the best way forward in a business meeting or even think through something that confuses us. Good people trip up on all of these from time to time, and in a decade and a half of explaining this stuff to people, these are some of the propaganda techniques and traps that have caught my attention that I think sometimes fly under the radar of a lot of people.